Greetings, I am Samuel Dodge with the Journal of Territorial and Maritime Studies, and I have the pleasure to be speaking today with Dr. David Scott. Dr. Scott is a prolific author in the fields of international, intercultural, and interfaith relations, having a publishing career that spans several decades, with countless research articles and 3 books with a 4th on the way, and having delivered lectures at government agencies throughout the world, as well as in his former position as a lecturer at Brunel University in the UK. Dr. Scott is now with us today to discuss his recent article on the Indo-Pacific Small Island Strategies of Large Powers, published in the Winter-Spring 2021 issue of JTMS. First off, Dr. Scott, welcome, and thank you for taking the time to speak with us.
Thank you.
That being said, before we get into questions regarding the content of your article, for those of our readers who may not be familiar with your research, could you give us a quick introduction to your background as a scholar and author, and how that background plays into your particular approach to IR analysis? And perhaps you might also be willing to share a quick summary of the scope and research and importance of this article.
Okay. I think the article reflects 2 converging interests in a sense. One interest that I have generally, geopolitics and geoeconomics in general, and then the second strand has been the rise of strategic areas, and in particular the shifts in global importance of particular areas, and in this respect the earlier or the current rise of India and China has become entwined with regionally the construction of new regions, and in this case the Indo-Pacific. So the talk of the Pacific century has given way to the Indo-Pacific as a strategic construct by various powers. Returning to the geography, the Indo-Pacific is of course the site for the interaction of various significant powers who have all adopted various Indo-Pacific strategies, with the exception, of course, of China, who doesn't particularly like the term Indo-Pacific, precisely for the reason that it sees it as a construct aimed against China. The irony here, of course, is that China itself is a thoroughly Indo-Pacific power, geopolitically and geoeconomically, with its 2-navy maritime doctrine, push into the Indian Ocean and Pacific, and of course the maritime Silk Route. So looking at the convergence of those 2 themes, the Indo-Pacific as a zone for geopolitical and geoeconomic encounter and reaction and responses, it was then interesting that this is a primarily maritime zone, maritime stretches of waters, within which islands have got a rising geopolitical and geoeconomic significance. And it was then further interesting that the way in which islands combine aspects of territorial features and of course maritime features, which is in a sense the very title of the journal, Journal of Maritime Studies, Territorial and Maritime Studies. And islands in a sense have got features of both land territoriality and maritime consequences, last but not least of which is of course entitlement to exclusive economic zones arising under Unschloss from properly designated islands, which of course then raises the interesting issue of when are islands islands, together with the very basic geography of the situation, which is in the 21st century, islands are both disappearing but also appearing. Islands as state constructions, in terms of literally being constructed, of which China's activities are the most obvious, and of islands being not just geographical features, but legally constructed, legally recognized, or in fact not legally recognized. So it's really the interaction of the geopolitics and the geoeconomics, and the construction of regions, regional strategies, but of course the perceptions of the region being itself very much a question of construction, and hence an interest in constructivism generally, alongside the hard politics of geopolitics and geoeconomics.
You mentioned the rising importance of islands and the changing nature of states' Indo-Pacific strategies regarding small islands. What are some of the commonalities between the small island strategies that you observed across all the great powers? And what primary points of differentiation have you observed?
The common, there are two common features. One is the recognition of the value of islands as for bases and for basing facilities, and in that sense, be it under their own sovereignty, or be it through arrangements with the host countries, the United States, France, Japan have certainly, and India, have certainly been recognizing the values of islands in that particular basing facility setting. The other commonality is and France as well, the other commonality would be their value, or rather potential value, for the exclusive economic zones around them. Although one of the points made in the article is that probably the states, although recognizing the potential value of exclusive economic zones, and in the case of France, seeing this with a matter of some pride, I would say. France repeatedly will mention, when it talks about the Indo-Pacific, that it has the second biggest exclusive economic zones in the world, and that 90% of them come from the Indo-Pacific. But as I say, there is probably some mismatch between the rhetoric of recognizing the importance of exclusive economic zones, but actually utilizing them for those purposes. But that's, in a sense, perhaps another issue. The differentiation, I would, I think probably the biggest differentiation is that I don't see too much differentiation, actually, now that I reflect on it. I was going to say that I think the one differentiation here is that because France on the face of it, is an external power, because France is, on the face of it, a European power, far away. Because of that, France in particular places great stress on its islands as giving it legitimacy within the Indo-Pacific. It will constantly stress that its island possessions are overseas departments, and as such, France is a resident Indo-Pacific power. Other powers like Japan and India are obviously Indo-Pacific powers through their very, in a sense, heartlands. The United States as well, in the sense that, North America, Alaska, California is already on the Pacific Rim, although obviously its islands further westwards give it further resident power legitimacy. But no, to return to the question, the differentiation is, the only differentiation I would see is probably that for France, their island possessions is crucial, is the only legitimacy that is generated for France as an Indo-Pacific power. The other, in a sense, greater powers that were being mentioned are already resident powers through their sort of baseline territories, as it were.
In your bio, you note a particular career focus on IR constructivism and the effect that images and perceptions have on state actions. Looking at the actions of the great powers regarding their island claims as laid out in your article, in what manner does the constructivist model apply when certain powers are willing to buck the conventions of the IR social structure and place higher importance on direct national interest than on how the pursuit of said interest is perceived?
Unpackaging it in two ways. My own interest, in a sense, in constructivism was partly generated from my overlapping interest in the interaction of states, which itself arose from a wider interest in East-West interactions, full stop. If we're looking at the interactions between states, then the role of perceptions in the way that states perceive each other can and has played an important, at times, governing role in the way that interactions then take place, which is why constructivism and the way that states perceive but also misperceive, so perceptions and misperceptions, has long been an interest for me, geoculturally as well as geopolitically. When we turn to the Indo-Pacific, and in terms of when we turn to the Indo-Pacific, constructivism to some extent has applications. The Indo-Pacific itself is a construct. Chinese and Russian criticisms of the Indo-Pacific is itself a counter narrative. So certainly there are constructions all around the situation. For myself, I'm not too worried about any apparent clashes between constructivism and, say, hardline geopolitics, because it remains true that Indo-Pacific formulations are indeed constructs reflecting national interests, reflecting national fears, national aspirations. In that sense, constructs are thoroughly political. And for me, constructivism doesn't particularly cut against it. That is the nature of constructs. But to focus on the particular thing, with regard to the way that countries, great powers, misuse small islands. Does constructivism have much insight there? In a sense, largely no, because I think, to be realistic, school of realism, great powers are indeed dealing with small islands, largely from geopolitical and geoeconomic imperatives. And as such, at first view, constructivism does not have much insights to offer. However, when we get down to, I think there are some, interesting sort of areas within that, but in a sense, constructivism is still having something to say, which is with regard to areas where great powers like China are, on the one hand, militarizing islands, creating artificial islands in the South China Sea, which at face value alienates and puts a wedge between China and Southeast Asian countries, and a wedge between China and ASEAN. How is China responding to that? Now, in a sense, hardline geopolitics, hardline realism continues to show that China is very determined to reassert what it sees as its national interests, its national sovereignty, its core interests, and so forth. However, so in that sense, China shows absolutely no signs of moderating its particular behavior towards small islands. Having said that, though, what China is simultaneously doing is pushing its Maritime Silk Road initiative, win-win cooperation, as a way of constructing a different message, a different image. If it pushes the Maritime Silk Road, economic cooperation with Southeast Asian nations, then its simultaneous great power politics vis-a-vis islands can be sort of muted. So what I would say is that, again, the rhetoric of China's Maritime Silk Road initiative is itself a construct that in part reflects strategic realism of diverting Southeast Asian attention away from the otherwise extremely divisive nature of China's activity in those islands. The other but it remains true that classic constructivism, particularly social constructivism of state state actions being modified by gradual acceptance of particular norms, the internationalization argument. One could argue that this may be a process in the South China Sea with China-ASEAN discussions over codes of good conduct and so forth. Is this modifying behavior? If it is, then that would be a good example of social constructivism. Unfortunately, the empirical evidence is that this so far has not gone very far. So code of conduct actually signed back in 2005, I think it was, although I'd have to slightly check on that date for that. The very fact that this code of conduct has in a sense not been applied has been shown by militarization and confrontations, but it has also been shown to have not been applied by the very fact that they're now negotiating for a legal code of conduct to underpin the original code of conduct. But even that discussion has not actually got anywhere, because they're merely talking about principles that could be agreed on to start negotiations about a legal code of conduct. So this is like 2 decades of theoretically a code of conduct already agreed. So in that sense, socialization and thus social constructivism hasn't really sort of achieved much traction. And I think, to be quite honest, the reason for that is that Chinese state policy is governed by thoroughly empirical geopolitical, geoeconomic drives, which under Xi Jinping has become very determined and in that sense very forceful, with a readiness to use force if necessary. So to that extent, social constructivism is not very evident. An interesting situation, though, there would be the extent to which the United Kingdom will face growing pressure to conform to rule of law principle and rule of law norms with regard to its important island base of Diego Garcia, which is also important for the United States, given the increasing pressure at the United Nations and under various legal frameworks there. So in fact, the United Kingdom, which on the face of it is a norm observing state, which is certainly emphasizing the importance of the rule of law, is in fact now faced with a growing pressure there. And that will be an interesting situation, because potentially constructivism should have more influence on a state like the United Kingdom than on a state like China, under Xi Jinping, that is.
Thank you again for taking the time to share your thoughts with us this morning, Dr. Scott. We hope that this has gotten some potential readers interested in reviewing your article and provided additional contextualization for those who have already read your piece. Do you have any final thoughts that you wish to leave us with?
As I say, the interest running through in terms of the original article and the journal was in fact the way in which islands had this curious sort of territorial nature, territorial value, alongside maritime value, and maritime status. It was this entwining of the two things that was of particular interest, and enjoyment actually shaping that particular article. Territorial and Maritime, Great Powers, Small Islands.